Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead as he hauled another bucket of water across the stable floor. The Grand Galactic Council Palace towered above him, all gleaming crystal spires and floating platforms where the real business of the universe happened. Down here in the underground stables, the air smelled of hay, alien musk, and the particular tang of creatures from 100 different worlds. Nobody ever came down here unless they had to. The servants who worked the upper levels treated the stables like they didn't exist, and the alien dignitaries who owned the exotic mounts rarely bothered to check on them. They just expected their rides to be ready when needed, clean and fed and perfectly behaved. Jake didn't mind being invisible. In fact, he preferred it. Up there, in the marble halls and conference rooms, everyone was fighting for position, for recognition, for power. Down here it was just him and the animals. They didn't care that he was human, didn't care that he had no family name or fancy education. They just wanted someone to treat them kindly. He moved to the stall housing a Veltorian sand glider, a six-legged creature with iridescent fur that shifted colors in the dim light. The creature was pacing nervously, making a low clicking sound in its throat. "Hey there, buddy," Jake said softly, approaching slowly with his hand extended. "Bad dreams again?" The sand glider stopped pacing and pressed its enormous head against Jake's chest. He scratched behind its ear equivalent, right where he'd learned it liked. The creature's clicking turned to a contented purr. This was Jake's gift, though he'd never call it that. He could just sense what the animals needed. When they were scared, when they were sick, when they just needed a friend. His supervisor, Locke, a massive Zentari with 4 arms and a perpetual scowl, said Jake was wasting his time talking to creatures that couldn't understand him. But Jake knew better. Maybe they didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone, the intention behind it. He'd been working at the stables for 3 years now, ever since he'd drifted into the capital with nothing but the clothes on his back. He'd been 17 then, an orphan from a human colony world that had fallen on hard times. The council didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat for broke humans with no skills, but they always needed someone willing to shovel alien manure for minimum wage. Jake finished his rounds, checking on the Corthian wing beast with the injured Talon, feeding the colony of Praxian tunnel diggers their protein paste, and making sure the Zenthorian mount had fresh bedding that wouldn't irritate its sensitive skin. By the time he was done, his back ached and his clothes were covered in various substances he'd rather not think about. That's when Locke stomped into the stable, looking even more irritated than usual. "Human. There's a delivery. Cargo Bay 3. They need someone to move it to the archival storage." Jake nodded and headed toward the cargo bay, grabbing a hovercart on the way. The palace was a maze of tunnels and service corridors that most people never saw. He'd learned every inch of them over the years. When he reached Cargo Bay 3, he found a transport crew lounging around 3 massive containers. Each one was about 6 feet tall, oval-shaped, and covered in warning labels written in a dozen languages. Through the transparent sections of the containers, Jake could see what looked like enormous eggs. They were dark, almost black, but with veins of gold running through them that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. "What are these?" Jake asked. One of the transport workers, a bored-looking Corlaxian, barely glanced up from his data pad. "Archival specimens. Dead planet, dead species. Council wants them in storage." "Just rocks, really?" "They don't look like rocks," Jake said, moving closer. The eggs radiated warmth he could feel even through the containment fields. "Whatever, human. Just get them to sub-level 9, archive section. We got 3 more deliveries today." The transport crew began loading the containers onto Jake's hovercart with shocking carelessness. They were laughing about something, not paying attention when one of the containers slipped. Jake's heart jumped into his throat. He dove forward, arms outstretched, and somehow caught the massive container before it hit the ground. It was heavier than it looked, and the impact drove him to his knees, but he held on. Through the transparent section, he could see the egg inside had shifted but remained intact. "Careful," he shouted. The workers just laughed. "Relax, stable boy. If they survived 10,000 years in a dead world's vault, they can handle a little drop." But Jake could feel something through the container, a warmth that was almost like a heartbeat. These weren't just rocks or artifacts. Something inside these eggs was alive. He carefully secured all 3 containers on the hovercart and began the slow journey to sub-level 9. But something felt wrong about leaving them in cold storage. Instead, he made a decision that would change everything. He brought them to the stables, to the empty stall in the back that nobody used. He set up heating lamps and surrounded the eggs with soft bedding. It was probably stupid. They were probably just geological formations or something. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they needed care, not storage. That night, after everyone else had gone, Jake sat on an old crate in front of the 3 eggs. The stable was quiet except for the soft breathing of sleeping creatures and the occasional rustle of movement. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said quietly, "but if there's anything alive in there, you're safe now. I promise." The golden veins in the eggs began to pulse faster, brighter. Then one by one cracks appeared in their dark surfaces. Light spilled out, filling the stable with a warm golden glow that felt like sunrise after a long night. Jake stood up slowly, his heart pounding. Whatever was about to happen, he knew the galaxy would never be the same. The first egg split down the middle with a sound like breaking glass. Jake stumbled backward, not from fear but from pure shock. A small head poked through the opening, covered in scales that shimmered between deep crimson and gold. The creature blinked at him with eyes that held far too much intelligence for a newborn. Within seconds the other 2 eggs cracked open. 3 baby dragons, each no bigger than a large dog, tumbled onto the bedding Jake had prepared. They were wet, shaking, and made soft chirping sounds that tugged at something deep in his chest. One was crimson and gold, another was silver blue like moonlight on water, and the third was deep bronze with amber highlights. Jake knelt slowly, extending his hand. "Hey there, little ones. Welcome to the world." The crimson dragon took a tentative step forward, sniffing his fingers. Then all 3 rushed toward him at once, pressing against his chest and legs, still chirping in those heartbreaking baby sounds. They were cold and scared and looking for warmth, for safety, for a parent they didn't have. Jake wrapped his arms around them as best he could. "It's okay. I've got you. You're safe." That's when the alarms started blaring. The stable doors burst open and suddenly the quiet space was filled with people. Scientists in white coats, military personnel in armor, council observers in their formal robes. Someone must have been monitoring the archival specimens, and the moment they hatched, half the palace descended on Jake's stable. A tall Corlaxian in a lab coat pushed to the front. His name tag read Dr. Vex, head of xenobiology. "Step away from the specimens immediately. These creatures require immediate containment and analysis." The baby dragons pressed closer to Jake, their chirping turning to frightened squeaks. He could feel their terror washing over him like a physical wave. Somehow, without words, he understood exactly what they were feeling. "They're scared," Jake said, keeping his voice calm even as his heart raced. "They just hatched. They need time to adjust." Dr. Vex wasn't listening. He gestured to his team. "Bring the specimen chambers. We need full neural scans, genetic sequencing, and behavioral analysis. This is an unprecedented discovery. The Dracathi have been extinct for 10 millennia. 2 scientists approached with containment fields activated. The baby dragons saw the crackling energy barriers and panicked. They scattered in 3 directions, knocking over water buckets and crashing into stall walls. The crimson one, the bravest of the 3, turned and breathed out a small jet of flame in warning. The stable erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward with stun weapons. The other animals in their stalls began making distressed sounds, feeding off the tension in the air. Dr. Vex was shouting orders, scientists were trying to corner the dragons, and the babies were becoming more terrified by the second. Jake did the only thing he could think of. He whistled, sharp and clear, the same sound he used to call the stable animals during feeding time. All 3 dragons stopped. Their heads swiveled toward him. "Come here," Jake said softly, crouching down and opening his arms. "Come on. Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm here." For a moment nothing happened. The entire room held its breath. Then the crimson dragon took a step toward Jake. Then another. The other 2 followed, and within seconds, all 3 were huddled against him again, hiding their faces against his chest and arms. A military commander stepped forward. His uniform was decorated with enough metals to sink a small ship. "Stable hands, step aside. These creatures are now under council jurisdiction. They're potentially dangerous and require proper handling." "Their names are Ember, Ash, and Spark," Jake said quietly, not moving. "And they're not dangerous. They're babies who just got born into a room full of strangers pointing weapons at them." The commander's face darkened. "This is not a request. Move now or we'll move you." He reached for Jake's shoulder. Ember, the crimson dragon, moved faster than anyone expected. She whipped around and breathed a jet of flame that singed the commander's sleeve. Not enough to hurt him, but enough to make him jump back. "Stand down," the commander shouted. "Weapons hot." "No." Jake threw himself over the dragons, spreading his arms as wide as he could. "Don't shoot. They're just protecting themselves. Wouldn't you do the same?" For a long moment, nobody moved. Jake could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. The dragons were trembling beneath him, and he realized they weren't just scared. They were looking to him for protection. A nobody stable boy who barely made enough credits to eat. A woman's voice cut through the tension. Stand down. All of you. The crowd parted and a human woman in diplomatic robes walked forward. Ambassador Patricia Hayes was one of the few high-ranking humans in the council, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that made people listen. She looked at the scene with sharp eyes. The frightened dragons, the protective stable boy, the armed guards ready to fire. Then she looked at Dr. Vex. Doctor, when was the last time your containment protocols successfully handled a newborn of any species without causing severe trauma? Dr. Vex sputtered. Ambassador, these are not ordinary newborns. They're Dracathi. Ancient, powerful, and according to every historical record, extremely dangerous. They're also clearly bonded to this young man, Patricia said. She turned to Jake. What's your name? Jake, ma'am. I work in the stables. Jake, can you get them to calm down? Jake nodded. He began humming softly, a lullaby his mother had sung to him when he was very small before she died. He stroked the dragon's scales, feeling the warmth of their bodies, the rapid beating of their hearts. Slowly their trembling eased. The chirping quieted. Patricia watched this with an expression Jake couldn't read. Then she made a decision that would echo through the galaxy. The hatchlings stay with Jake. They'll be monitored, studied if necessary, but from a distance. No containment, no forced separation. We try this the gentle way first. Dr. Vex looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Ambassador, I must protest. We have no idea what these creatures are capable of. Then we learn, Patricia said firmly. But we learn without traumatizing 3 newborns in the process. Jake, you'll be compensated for this additional duty. The dragons are now under your care. As the crowd slowly dispersed, still muttering and casting backward glances, Jake sat on the stable floor with 3 baby dragons curled up in his lap. They'd finally stopped shaking. Ember's head rested against his chest, and he could swear she was purring. For the first time in his life, people had noticed Jake. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. But looking down at the 3 creatures who trusted him completely, who'd chosen him in their first moments of life, he knew one thing for certain. He'd protect them. No matter what came next. The first week was chaos. Jake barely slept, keeping watch over the 3 dragons as they adjusted to their new world. They grew at an alarming rate, doubling in size every few days. By the end of the first week, they were as large as ponies. By the second week they were the size of small shuttles. Ember, the Crimson One, was bold and protective. She positioned herself between Jake and anyone who approached too quickly. Ash, the Silver-Blue Dragon, was thoughtful and curious, always watching everything with those intelligent eyes. Spark, the Bronze One, was playful and affectionate, constantly trying to engage Jake in games of chase around the stable. Jake learned their personalities the way some people learn languages. It came naturally to him, this understanding of what they needed before they even asked. When Ember paced restlessly, he knew she needed to stretch her growing wings. When Ash stared at the star charts on Jake's old datapad, he knew she was hungry for knowledge. When Spark made soft whimpering sounds, he knew the dragon was feeling lonely and needed company. But it was more than just observation. Something deeper was happening. One morning, Jake woke to find all 3 dragons staring at him intently. Then, without warning, images flooded his mind. Not words, but pure sensation and memory. He saw a vast city of crystal spires, beings that looked like the dragons but fully grown and magnificent, speaking in voices that resonated with power. He felt pride ancient and deep. He felt wisdom accumulated over thousands of generations. And then he felt something else. Sickness. Fear. Death spreading like wildfire through a civilization too proud to ask for help. Jake gasped and the connection broke. The dragons were still watching him, their eyes glowing faintly. Was that real? He whispered. Was that your people? Ember lowered her massive head and touched her snout to Jake's forehead. More images came, gentler this time. The Dracathi had been guardians once, beings who helped younger species find their way among the stars. But pride had been their downfall. When the plague came, they refused to admit weakness, refused to seek help from those they'd once guided. They died alone and their cities crumbled to dust. I'm so sorry, Jake said, wrapping his arms around Ember's neck as far as they would reach. I'm so sorry that happened to you. The other stable animals had gotten used to the dragons by now. The Veltorian sand glider would often sleep curled up against Spark's warm scales. The Korthian wing beast preened Ash's head ridges with its beak. Even Locke, Jake's grumpy supervisor, had stopped complaining about the extra work. Though he'd never admit it, Jake had caught him sneaking treats to Ember when he thought no one was watching. By the third week, scientists from across the council were begging for access to the dragons. Dr. Vex submitted formal requests daily. Military strategists wanted to understand their capabilities. Historians wanted to unlock their genetic memories. Everyone wanted something from them. The dragons refused to cooperate with anyone except Jake. When Dr. Vex finally got permission to approach with scanning equipment, Ash simply turned invisible. Actually invisible. One moment she was there, the next she'd vanished completely. The scientists went into a frenzy until Jake calmly asked her to come back, and she shimmered back into view, looking rather pleased with herself. When a military officer tried to test Ember's flame breath, she yawned and blew a perfect smoke ring instead. Spark, asked to demonstrate his strength, simply curled up and pretended to sleep. Ambassador Patricia visited regularly, observing from a respectful distance. She never pushed, never demanded. She just watched Jake work with the dragons and took notes. "You have a gift," she told him one afternoon. "Most people see these creatures and think about what they can get from them. You just see them for what they are." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "They're just scared and trying to figure out this world. Same as I was when I got here." 1 month after the hatching, everything changed again. Jake was teaching Spark the difference between edible and non-edible stable equipment when he felt a presence in his mind. Not images this time, but something that felt almost like words. He turned to find all 3 dragons arranged in a semicircle, their eyes glowing with that strange inner light. Then Ember spoke. Actually spoke with a voice like rolling thunder and crackling fire. "Jake. Friend. Kin." Jake nearly fell over. "You can talk." "Always could," Ash said, her voice like wind chimes and flowing water. "Needed to learn your speaking first." "And you're very slow learners, you humans," Spark added, his voice warm and amused like summer sun on bronze. "Took you forever to understand our mind pictures." Jake laughed, the sound half shock and half joy. "Why didn't you tell anyone else you could talk?" "Because they don't listen," Ember said. "They hear sounds but don't understand meaning. You listen with more than ears. You listen with heart." That afternoon a delegation arrived. Not scientists this time, but council members. Important ones. They wore robes stitched with symbols of rank and power, and they walked like people who expected the universe to bend around them. The leader was a tall alien with crystalline skin named High Counselor Thrain. "We've been patient," he announced. "But the council requires access to these creatures for proper study and integration into galactic society. They possess abilities we need to understand and document." Jake stood between the counselor and the dragons. "They're not things to be studied. They're people. Living, thinking beings with their own choices." "They're animals," Thrain said dismissively. "Impressive ones certainly, but animals nonetheless. And you're a stable boy with no authority to speak on council matters." That's when Ember stepped forward. She'd grown large enough now that her shadow covered half the stable. When she spoke, every person in the room froze. "We are Drakathy. We are the voice of 10,000 years. We are the memory of a civilization that guided this galaxy before your species learned to walk upright. And we choose our bondkin. We choose Jake." The words echoed through the stable and beyond. Through open doorways, other staff members heard it. Through communication devices accidentally left active, council members across the palace heard it. Within minutes, news was spreading through the entire galactic capital. The ancient dragons had returned, and they'd chosen a human stable boy as their equal. High Counselor Thrain's crystalline face somehow managed to look pale. "That's impossible. The old treaties, the voice of the old compact, those laws are ancient history." "Ancient, yes," Ash said, stepping forward to flank Jake on the other side. "But still law. Still binding. Still true." "We have spoken," Spark finished, completing the circle around Jake. "Let those who would challenge this speak now." Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Jake looked at the 3 dragons who'd become his family, who saw something in him that he'd never seen in himself. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "I don't want power or authority. I just want to take care of them. Can't we just keep things simple?" Ember's rumbling laugh filled the stable. "Nothing is simple anymore, Jake. But we face it together. Always together." The council chamber was packed tighter than Jake had ever seen it. Beings from 1,000 worlds filled every seat, every standing space, every viewing platform. News of the dragon's declaration had spread like wildfire through the galaxy, and now everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Jake stood in the center of the massive room, feeling incredibly small. He was still wearing his stable clothes because nobody had thought to tell him this was happening until an hour ago. The three dragons stood behind him, their presence somehow both comforting and terrifying at the same time. High Counselor Thrain stood at the main podium, his crystalline features set in hard lines. The council acknowledges that 3 Drakathy hatchlings have made a declaration of bond kinship with a human named Jake. However, we must address the legal implications of such a claim. A murmur ran through the crowd. Jake noticed Ambassador Patricia in the front row, watching intently. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. A skeletal alien in flowing robes stood up. I am Keeper Voth, guardian of ancient laws. I've spent the last 3 days researching the old compact. The law is clear. Any being sworn to fealty by a Drakathy elder is recognized as a voice of the old compact, with authority superseding even this council. But these are juveniles, not elders, Thrain interrupted. The law cannot possibly apply. That's where you're wrong, another voice called out. An elderly human woman made her way to the speaker's platform. Her name was Dr. Helen Cross, and she was one of the galaxy's leading experts on extinct civilizations. Jake had seen her once or twice in the archives, always buried in ancient texts. Dr. Cross activated a holographic display. Ancient symbols filled the air above the council floor. The Drakathy didn't reach adulthood in the way we understand it. They were born with full genetic memory, carrying the knowledge and authority of every ancestor who came before them. A newborn Drakathy has access to thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. That's scientifically impossible, Dr. Vex objected from his seat. Watch, Ember said. The 3 dragons moved together, forming a triangle around Jake. Their eyes began to glow, not with reflected light, but with something that seemed to come from deep within. The temperature in the room rose, and Jake felt the air practically humming with energy. Then they changed. Not physically, but something about their presence expanded. When they spoke, it wasn't with 3 young voices, but with the layered sound of hundreds, thousands of voices speaking as one. We are Kethrix, who guided the first travelers to the stars. We are Velmora, who taught the art of peaceful negotiation to the gathering worlds. We are Thormund, who stood against the void scourge when darkness threatened all life. We are 10,000 years of memory, wisdom, and authority. We are Drakathy, and we are eternal. The chamber fell absolutely silent. Even Thrain seemed at a loss for words. The presence the dragons projected was overwhelming, ancient, and undeniable. Jake felt it washing over him like standing at the edge of an ocean, feeling the weight of all that water, all that depth, all that power. Then as quickly as it came, the presence faded. The dragons were young again, standing protectively around Jake. We have shown you, Ash said in her normal voice. Do you still doubt? Keeper Voth bowed deeply, something Jake had never seen anyone do in council chambers. I do not doubt. The law is clear. The declaration is valid. Thrain's hands clenched on the podium. Even if we accept this, we must consider what it means. This human has no training in governance, no education in galactic law, no experience in leadership. He's a stable worker. So, Jake found himself speaking before he could stop himself. The entire chamber turned to look at him. His face felt hot, but he pressed on. Yeah, I'm a stable worker. I clean up after animals that most people won't even look at. I make sure creatures who can't speak for themselves are fed and safe and cared for. Is that somehow worth less than sitting in meetings all day? A ripple of surprised laughter ran through parts of the crowd. Thrain looked furious. You dare to speak to this council with such disrespect? I speak with honesty, Jake said, his fear starting to fade. And maybe that's what the dragons saw in me. I don't want your power or your authority. I didn't ask for any of this. But I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not just to make you comfortable. Ambassador Patricia stood up. If I may address the council? I've been observing Jake for the past month. I've seen how he handles the dragons, how he treats every being with equal respect regardless of their status or species. Perhaps that's exactly the quality we need in a voice of the old compact. The ambassador makes a fair point, another council member said. The old text described the voice as a mediator, not a ruler. Someone who speaks truth without political agenda. This is ridiculous, a sharp voice cut in. Director Wilson stood up from the human delegation section. He was a politician who'd built his career on careful maneuvering and strategic alliances. We're talking about giving ultimate authority to someone based on the whim of 3 animals who've been alive for less than 2 months. What's next? Should we let the stable boy negotiate our treaties? Decide our laws? If necessary, yes, Spark said simply. The chamber erupted. Some species were shouting in agreement, others in outrage. Arguments broke out in a dozen languages. Jake watched it all, feeling completely overwhelmed. This wasn't what he wanted. He just wanted to go back to the stables, to his quiet life taking care of creatures who needed him. Ember's tail wrapped gently around his waist, a gesture of comfort. "Stay strong," she whispered in his mind. "They fear change. They fear what they cannot control." Finally, Keeper Voth struck a resonance gong that silenced the chamber. "The law does not care about our comfort or preferences. The Drakathy have made their choice according to ancient protocol. We can accept it, or we can declare the old compact null and void." "And if we do that?" Thrain asked. "Then we admit that our word, our treaties, our laws mean nothing when they become inconvenient. We tell the galaxy that the Council's authority rests not on justice, but on power alone." The weight of those words settled over the chamber. Jake saw understanding dawn on faces throughout the room. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what kind of civilization they wanted to be. The vote, when it came, wasn't unanimous. But it was decisive. The old compact was recognized. Jake was officially declared a voice, with all the authority and responsibility that came with it. As the chamber slowly emptied, Jake stood in the center, feeling like the universe had just turned upside down. The dragons pressed close around him, their warmth and presence anchoring him. "What do I do now?" he asked quietly. "What you've always done," Ash said. "You see what needs care and you care for it. The galaxy is not so different from your stables. It's full of creatures who need someone to notice them." Jake looked at his hands, still stained from morning chores. Nothing about him had changed. He was still just a kid who'd grown up with nothing and nowhere to belong. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly who the galaxy needed. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare Jake hadn't seen coming. Suddenly, everyone wanted something from him. Politicians showed up at the stables with fake smiles and careful words, trying to convince him to support their causes. Business leaders offered him credits, estates, entire planets if he'd just use his influence with the dragons to back their ventures. Senator Graham Stone was the worst. He arrived with a whole entourage, dressed in robes that probably cost more than Jake would make in 10 lifetimes. "Think about it, Jake. With the dragons behind you, you could reshape galactic policy. Support our trade initiatives and you'll have wealth beyond imagination." Jake was mucking out Spark's stall when Stone made his pitch. He didn't stop working. "Not interested." "You're making a mistake," Stone said, his smile tightening. "In this galaxy you're either at the table or on the menu." "Then I guess I'll take my chances," Jake replied, dumping another shovel full of soiled bedding into the cart. After Stone left, Ambassador Patricia found Jake sitting outside the stables watching the sunset. "They're not going to stop," she said gently. "You've become the most powerful wild card in galactic politics." "I don't want to be a wild card. I don't want any of this." Jake threw a pebble across the courtyard. "I just want to take care of the dragons and do my job." "I know," Patricia said. "But the galaxy doesn't always give us what we want." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about all the people who wanted to use him, to manipulate him into becoming their weapon or their tool. The dragons sensed his distress and curled around him, their warm bodies forming a protective barrier against the world. "They see power," Ember said softly. "They don't see you." "I wish they'd just forget about me," Jake muttered. "Some wish exactly that," Ash said, her voice carrying a warning Jake didn't understand until the next day. The council was in full session when it happened. Jake had been summoned to observe, though he still didn't fully understand why. He stood at the back, trying to be invisible, when Ambassador Patricia was presenting a proposal for protecting endangered species across the outer colonies. That's when Jake saw the shimmer in the air behind her. Years of working with animals had taught him to notice things others missed, tiny details that meant danger. He saw the slight distortion, the way light bent wrong in one spot. "Patricia, move!" Jake shouted, running forward. The plasma bolt meant for the ambassador seared through the air where her head had been a second before. Jake crashed into her, knocking her aside. They hit the floor hard as chaos erupted throughout the chamber. The 3 dragons reacted instantly. They were there in seconds, having somehow sensed the danger even from the stables below. Their roar shook the entire building. Energy crackled around them, raw power that made the air itself feel heavy. Their eyes blazed with fury that was ancient and terrifying. Guards rushed in, weapons drawn, but they were looking for an assassin. The dragons were looking for revenge. The temperature in the chamber skyrocketed. Metal started to glow red-hot. Stone began to crack under the pressure of their rage. Jake scrambled to his feet. Stop. Please stop. The dragons didn't hear him. Or if they did, their fury was too great. Jake could feel it pouring off them in waves. Someone had tried to kill their bond kin, and the Dracathi did not forgive such things. Ember. Spark. Jake threw himself in front of the dragons, spreading his arms wide. This isn't who you are. This isn't who we are. They tried to end you, Ember snarled, smoke pouring from her nostrils. They deserve the fire. Maybe, Jake said, his voice shaking but determined. But if you burn them, you become what they fear. You prove everyone right who said you're just dangerous beast. Is that what you want? The dragons paused. The energy crackling around them flickered. Your people died because they were too proud to ask for help, too proud to show weakness, Jake continued. Don't make the same mistake by being too proud to show mercy. The silence stretched. Then, slowly the energy faded. The temperature dropped. The dragon's eyes dimmed back to their normal glow. Ember lowered her massive head until it was level with Jake's. You ask much of us, she said quietly. I know, Jake replied, reaching up to touch her scaled cheek. But I'm asking anyway. An elderly council member Jake didn't recognize stood up slowly. He was human, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. I'm Robert Hayes, Patricia's grandfather. I've served on this council for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened. He looked at Jake with an expression of wonder. You just held ultimate power in your hands. The dragons would have leveled this building if you'd given the word. But you chose mercy over revenge. Forgiveness over fury. I chose what felt right, Jake said simply. And that, Robert said, is exactly why the dragons chose you. The would-be assassin was found, a hired gun working for a coalition of business interests that saw Jake as a threat to their profits. Within days, 3 more plots were uncovered. The galaxy was full of people who feared what Jake represented. Someone who couldn't be bought, controlled, or intimidated. Senator Stone visited the stables one last time. You could have had everything, he said bitterly. Power, wealth, influence. Instead you're still here shoveling waste. Yeah, Jake said, not looking up from his work. But I can sleep at night. Can you? Stone left without answering. The official recognition ceremony happened a week later. They tried to make it elaborate, with speeches and formal robes and all the pageantry the council could muster. Jake stood through it all feeling awkward and out of place in clothes that didn't fit right. When it was his turn to speak, he kept it simple. I don't want authority over anyone. I don't want to make your laws or fight your battles. But I'll speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. I'll stand up for the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones everyone else ignores. That's what I did in the stables, and that's what I'll keep doing now. The applause was uncertain at first, then grew stronger. Not everyone was happy, but even those who opposed him seemed to respect his honesty. That evening, Jake made his final decision. He turned down the private quarters they offered, the staff, the luxury. Instead, he filed paperwork to establish something new, the Sanctuary of the Forgotten. It would be part shelter, part hospital, part refuge for any being who needed help. The abandoned, the injured, the lost, they'd all have a place. And it would be run from the stables, with the 3 dragons as its guardians. Ambassador Patricia helped him navigate the bureaucracy. You're really going to keep living in the stable quarters? She asked. It's home, Jake said. Besides, someone needs to make sure Spark doesn't eat all the protein paste. I heard that, Spark called from across the courtyard. The sanctuary opened quietly without fanfare. The first arrivals were a family of refugees whose transport had broken down in orbit, leaving them stranded with nowhere to go. Then came an injured Veltorian whose owner had abandoned it when it became too sick to ride. Then a young human girl who'd run away from an abusive situation and had nowhere else to turn. Jake treated them all the same. With kindness, with patience, with the same care he'd always shown the stable animals. The dragons helped however they could, using their growing powers to heal injuries, provide warmth, offer protection. Word spread slowly at first, then faster. The stable boy who'd been given ultimate authority and chose to keep shoveling waste. The voice of the old compact who spent his days feeding the hungry and sheltering the homeless. People didn't quite know what to make of him. But the beings he helped knew exactly what he was. He was hope. He was proof that kindness still mattered, that power didn't have to corrupt, that one person really could make a difference. 6 months after the dragons hatched, Jake stood in the courtyard of his sanctuary watching the sunset. The stables had expanded, but they were still stables. He was still Jake, still wearing work clothes stained with the day's labor. Ember settled beside him, now large enough that her shadow covered half the building. Do you regret it? The choice you made. Jake thought about the politicians and their offers, the wealth he'd turned down, the easy life he could have had. Then he thought about the little girl who'd smiled for the first time in months when Ash had played with her. The refugee family who'd found safety. The abandoned creatures who'd found love. Not even a little bit, he said. Good, Ember rumbled, smoke curling from her nostrils in contentment. Because we wouldn't change you for anything. The galaxy had changed because of a stable boy nobody noticed. And it would keep changing, one act of kindness at a time, proving that the greatest power wasn't strength or authority. It was compassion. It was seeing the worth in every living being. That was humanity's gift to the stars. And Jake would make sure the galaxy never forgot it.